Hello automators, thanks for tuning in again. If you're in the midst of preparing to replace your router or your Wi-Fi system in your smart home, then I have a video here full of tips and tricks that will help you prepare and also through the installation process make the right decisions. Now, as I explain a few things, I'm going to show you my unboxing of my Asus RT86U, and if you're still in the midst of choosing your Wi-Fi router, then you're going to want to have a look at another video that I produced here on Automate Your Life that actually helps you pick the best Wi-Fi router or mesh Wi-Fi system in your smart home. So I'll leave that up at the top right now and in the description down below so you can go ahead and watch that video before this one, then come back and watch the actual process that I went through. In terms of that setup process, everyone is going to have a slightly different setup in their home, and in some cases our setups are going to be very, very different. Now, what I mean by that is you could have multiple routers in your home. You could require an access point that is specific to your internet service provider. You could have a mesh Wi-Fi system that would be different than my system. So really, I can't go through this setup in a full way. I can't show you everything that you're going to run into in your smart home. But what I will do is give you these tips and tricks that are really important for, making the right decisions at the start of this process. Now, you saw me open up the box and get everything unpacked and opened up, but I want to talk to you about some of the components here in the box. Now, you can see the router itself, and I had to attach 3 antennas, and that is a very common thing for you to have to do, although some of the newer mesh systems don't have anything like that, and some routers don't, so don't be surprised if you don't see any antennas. They can be built right into the body of the device of the router. Now, there is a power adapter, of course, and I think you're going to find that on every device. I can't think of one that it doesn't. And you will, of course, find manuals and things that will help you get set up with your device. You can see with the Asus, they talk about a fast and easy setup, and it really was kind of 3 steps there. It wasn't any more difficult than that. Now, from there, down here at the bottom is an Ethernet cable, and this is called a straight-through Ethernet cable, and they explicitly tell you in the setup where to put it in the system. So this connected directly to, and I'm going to show you the back of the router here. You can see the blue colored Ethernet connection over here on the left hand side. Now that blue colored one is what faces the internet, or it's the thing that connects to your access point. So if you have an access point from your internet service provider, that's what's connecting there. And Asus was very clear that this was to be used with a straight through. There is another type of cable called a crossover cable, but in this case we didn't need it. Now, some of the other things on the back of this router, and you will find this in lots of systems, just not with systems like Google Wi-Fi or things like that have very simple connections. But over here on the left, you can see there's 2 USB ports, and one of those is for direct connection to a printer or direct connection to network storage, things like that. So you can have both of those things available to you if you have a router like this, and that makes them network available. You have to do some installation work, but that can make them network available. There's also a power adapter on the left, and then on the right hand side, what you're actually seeing are 4 connection points that you can go out throughout your house, and I have wiring in my home, but these are connections basically to your computers and your different wired Ethernet devices. Now you can see me just plugging into the back of my router, but I'm not going to plug in just yet. We should yet look at our original router, or the router that we're using right now. Now you can see mine right here, and some of you will be laughing at how old this thing is. This is what I was running my smart home off of, and they can actually last this long, but we were kind of hitting the limits at this point. So what you want to do before you go pulling a router like this is a few things. And the first thing I'll tell you is you just want to look at where it is physically and make sure that you can fit your new router in there physically as well. So you can run into a situation where the location is just too tight, or you're not going to be able to set your router in there. Now, once you've done that, have a look at the cables, and I took pictures of where my cables were going from, and that's what I would recommend for you. Just take pictures of where your cables are going to and from, so you know that you can always revert back, and that's really important for you to be able to revert back. So you can see on the back of my device here, very similar to the new device that I just showed you, you do see the WPS button, which is the quick wireless setup button, but then you also see that same blue Ethernet port. Because I'm replacing an Asus with another Asus, these color codes are really the same, and the yellow goes out to my different devices throughout my home. So really this router wired wise was very similar. The differences were in wireless and in the setup, which we can now talk about. Now on a PC or a Mac, what you want to do here, and I can't tell you what the command is for a Mac, I'm not going to bother, you'll have to look this up yourself, but on a PC, if you simply type into the bar there, the search bar, or whatever you want to call it, the Windows bar, CMD, and then hit enter, and you can see it's bringing up the command prompt. Now inside the command prompt, what you're going to do is type ipconfig, IPCONFIG, and at the bottom of that, once you hit enter, what you will find is what's called the default gateway. And the default gateway is the address that your router is basically sitting at in most cases, in most homes. So you can see mine was at 192.168.50.1, and you can then go to that in a web browser. So you actually just type that in, and you are going to the router setup page. Now, you have to have credentials here, and if you don't have your own credentials, you're going to have to find those. So there's not much I can do to help you pass that. Sometimes you can do hardware resets, but then you're losing all of the settings and all of the point of us getting in here. And the point is to, again, take pictures. So take screenshots of all your different settings and make sure you understand everything that you have in here, or at least have pictures of every setting, because what I'll tell you is lots of these settings you're going to want to have very similar in your new router. In general, start with just the basic setup of a router. If you're not really an administrator, a network administrator type, you're just going to want to let the basic settings go into your router. But there's a couple of settings that we can talk about now that will really keep things very simple as you install this new router and keep all of your smart home devices essentially connected. The first thing to talk about is right on the wireless page. So the SSID is what your wireless is named essentially. So whenever you look for wireless signals in your home and you see your wireless network, that SSID is what you have here in your router. Now, the wireless mode as well, you don't really have to worry about that in general if you've just left it on auto. And the channel bandwidth, that shouldn't matter either if that changes with your new router, nor your channel, but I would take note of your control channel, because that might be what you've found as a good spot in your building or in your home. If there's a number of other homes around you that are using other channels, then you might end up with some interference if your new router changes the Wi-Fi channel on this 2.4 gigahertz. That's what we're looking at on mine. Now, The other thing, or the biggest thing that you're going to want to keep the same, is the authentication method, the encryption, and the shared key, or your password basically for your Wi-Fi. So all of those things you want to keep consistent, and what will happen as you change your router over is everything will reconnect to the wireless with all of these settings basically remaining consistent, other than, like I said, your channel bandwidth and your control channel. Those could change, but if you change the SSID or the authentication method or the shared key or your password, that will cause you a lot of pain for your smart home devices. One other setting to talk about is DHCP. Now, if you don't know what that means, it's called Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. It basically means that your devices on your network will request an IP address from the router, and then the router will assign those to them. Otherwise, if you don't have DHCP turned on, then everything in your network has been given a IP address, and you'll want to make sure that you have all of those IP addresses written down, and then you're going to want to go back through and assign all of those IP addresses to the MAC address. So the MAC address is something that never changes on a device. That's basically always part of the device. So if you see a MAC address lining up with an IP address, you're going to want this table, and then you're going to have to fill that back out in your new router after you've done the switch over. In terms of your WAN connection, or basically, if you remember that blue cable that we plugged in, you're connecting to the internet through your internet service provider. Now, what you could find with your router is that it is actually into the access point that you already have from your internet service provider. But if it's direct, what you could have is a static IP, and you'll have to actually look at this setting to make sure essentially that you're mirroring it again, just like the DHCP settings. One other thing you might find in your current router is the ability to change into either a repeater or another access point. So you can actually go ahead and change this device to become a repeater, for example, in your home, to be a secondary device. Now, with Asus, there are some other routers that can become what's called part of an AI mesh system, and so that basically gives you a mesh system similar to Orbi or Google Wi-Fi. Now, obviously, that's not an exhaustive discussion on settings in a router. I mean, there are thousands of settings in most routers. So again, that's why this is a tips and tricks type of video, but I'm going to show you what the setup process was like once I had plugged in my router, and basically Asus made sure that I looked and that there were certain lights blinking on the front of my router before I went to a computer that was connected physically to the router, and simply typed in router.asus.com. Once I did that, it was basically putting in a login name and new password, and then retyping that password. From there, hitting next and moving to the next screen. From there, a firmware upgrade started because the router had an instant internet connection, and it took about 3 minutes, like it says on the screen. From there, it brought me straight to the wireless setup screen, and I think you're going to find this in almost every router out there today. What you're going to find is that they want you to set up the router next for wireless connection. And you can see now on my previous router, I only had one wireless network, and that was at 2.4 gigahertz. So this is something you might experience, where you end up with a second 5 gigahertz network name. Now, that would obviously be a different network name than your 2.4 gigahertz. And what I'll say is, if you didn't have a 5 gigahertz before, make that the new name in your wireless network and begin to switch devices over to 5G that are fast and relatively close to your router. So I just had to put in a couple of new wireless passwords, and then it went back to the login screen, and then I'm back into a very similar page that you guys saw before with all of my different settings. And now it was about copying any settings that I wanted to, but in general, anything that was connected before had reconnected to my new router, but there were a few exceptions in my smart home. The first exception was Philips Hue, and that bridge has a physical Ethernet connection directly to the router. Now, what I'll say is, again, I have all those Ethernet cables throughout my home, and so my hub was in a different place than my router physically, but as far as the device was concerned, it was physically connected. Same with my Samsung SmartThings version 2. Both of those hubs became disconnected. Now, the SmartThings recovered on its own and just did so relatively quickly. I'd say it took about 5 minutes, but Philips Hue, I actually had to do a power cycle on the device and then it remade its own connection. So don't go changing a bunch of settings if you can help it. Do the very simple things first, like give it some time and then unplug it, and even unplug it and give it, 5 minutes or 10 minutes to see if that will clear some of the settings or some of the things that are getting in the way on either your router or the Philips Hue hub itself, or the device that won't connect itself. In general, like I said, if you do what I told you to, keep basically the same wireless SSID and password and encryption type, then you will find every one of your wireless smart home products will come back. It will just take some time with some of those, and they may need a reset, but I'll tell you that within 5 minutes of turning on this router and putting in those credentials that you saw when I was doing the setup here in the router, everything had reconnected on its own, other than the Philips Hue hub, which I just had to do a power cycle on.